Perhaps nothing better demonstrates the colossal scale of Formula One than the newest addition to its 5-continent calendar, the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Starting in 2023, F1 was going to race down one of the most iconic roads in America, the Las Vegas Strip. But in order to facilitate that, they needed a paddock, the facility serving as temporary home to the 10 teams during race weekend. And specifically, they'd need a paddock close enough to the Strip, the street with some of the highest commercial land values in the entire world. But it was no issue for Formula One management, who paid $240 million for this square plot, just 1,300 feet or 400 meters long on each side. But that was just the start. Then they needed to actually build the paddock. The fast-tracked construction of the facility reportedly cost upwards of $100 million. Then they had to build the racetrack. This was to be a street race, taking place on otherwise public roads, but the conventional pavement did not even come close to meeting the standards necessary for the world's fastest racing series. Therefore, F1 spent 6 months and many millions more resurfacing the roads, much to the annoyance of Las Vegas locals who had to endure endless delays on the already congested streets. And construction ramped up even more around 2 months out as assembly of the grandstands, pedestrian bridges, and other temporary facilities began, requiring the relocation of trees, the draining of the Bellagio's iconic fountains, and plenty of other drastic changes to the Strip. All in, Formula One is reported to have spent upwards of $500 million developing its Vegas street circuit. So that's to say, they spent more than a small nation's GDP to build the facilities for one annual 90-minute race. To put that in perspective, just a few blocks to the south is the 4th most expensive stadium ever built in the entire world. It's called Allegiant Stadium, and it cost about $2 billion. Its primary purpose is to host the Las Vegas Raiders, the 11th most valuable sports team in the world. The Raiders, of course, play in the NFL, the highest revenue sports league in the world. Allegiant Stadium also hosts college football and wrestling and concerts and more, but if you ignore all that and just focus on the Raiders, dividing $2 billion in construction costs by 8 annual regular season home games brings you to a construction cost of $250 million per annual event. So that means, at minimum, F1 spent double as much in facility construction costs for its annual Las Vegas event. But of course, they don't just race in Vegas. A similar degree of disruption and devotion happens each year in Singapore, where the iconic streets of Marina Bay are shut down for its now legendary Grand Prix. And most iconically, the entire country of Monaco transforms into a racetrack each spring, leading up to its late May Grand Prix. And on top of that, the series stops at a half-dozen other street circuits, along with more than a dozen dedicated circuits dotted around the world each year, each pulling in 3, 4, sometimes close to 500,000 fans across race weekend. Few motorsports events pull in crowds even close to those of F1's, meaning these circuits have large portions of their infrastructure, parking lots, grandstands, buildings, that only ever get used once a year for that 90-minute F1 race. Despite this terrible inefficiency, plenty of these races actually turn a profit for the circuits and promoters. Not all, but enough that F1 now has far more venues vying to host a race than they can reasonably accommodate in an annual calendar. They've eliminated some less lucrative races and expanded the number of races each year, but still then, F1 is starting to schedule certain races only every 2 years to cope with demand and develop new markets. But just 1 decade ago, such thunderous growth would have seemed unimaginable. Throughout the 2010s, F1 was in a state of decline. Its viewership figures were shrinking year after year, and by 2015, this summed to a third of its audience gone in just 7 years. Proposed races were failing to get funding, existing races were canceling out of unprofitability. From audience figures to revenue, F1 was just failing on all fronts. And while marketing was poor and digital strategy was bad and leadership was weak, the largest explanation for the state of F1 in the mid-2010s was remarkably simple. Formula One was, unequivocally and objectively, just plain boring. You see, much of their viewer experience is wrapped up in the contribution of each race towards the season-long battle for drivers to score the most points and maintain the lead of the Drivers' Championship, the grand prize. In the 2015 season, reigning champion Lewis Hamilton won the very first race in Australia, meaning he started the season in first place of the Drivers' Championship. At the second race, in Malaysia, contender Sebastian Vettel won, but Hamilton's second place earned him enough points to stay in the lead of the Drivers' Championship. 2 weeks later in China, he won again, keeping him in the lead. In fact, throughout the 19 races of the 2015 season, Hamilton never left first place in the Drivers' Championship. From the audience's perspective, there was no struggle, no uncertainty, it was just pure dominance. Hamilton and his Mercedes teammate, Nico Rosberg, led a collective 82% of all laps, while the top 3 drivers combined led 97%. By the end of the season, Mercedes had won all but 3 of the 19 races. Racing was rarely tight. The Mercedes cars often finished dozens of seconds ahead of first place. For a casual TV audience, it was just plain boring. And 2015 was hardly unique in its boringness. Over the past 20 seasons, the Drivers' Championship has only been fought all the way till the final race 8 times. In all other seasons, a driver has mathematically clinched it earlier, sometimes by as much as 6 races, and a mathematical clinch always happens long after the audience considers the championship a foregone conclusion. So that's to say, F1 has a particular propensity for this style of boring dominance. As an entertainment business, it's potentially its fatal flaw. But the explanation for why Formula One can be boring is right in the name. It's the fault of the formula. The word formula in this context is a reference to the set of rules and regulations that govern what teams are allowed to change in a car's design and what they aren't. Essentially, any motor racing series has some equivalent set of rules and regulations, but F1's is uniquely open-ended. It's supposed to be a battle of driver skill and engineering prowess. This is in comparison to something like NASCAR, where all teams are given the exact same car, are allowed to do little beyond setup changes, and the sport is intended to be fundamentally a battle of driver skill. Even in IndyCar, F1's closest equivalent, teams are given limited freedom to modify the vehicles. While there certainly are other motorsport series that allow for open-ended development, with the exception of MotoGP, they don't tend to have large audiences because it often comes at the expense of entertainment. They often end up with scenarios where one car is just so dominant that driver skill can't make up for the difference. What's most exciting for a TV audience is to watch close racing won or lost by the drivers. The secretive development happening behind the scenes clearly does not translate into very exciting television. The sport attempts to mitigate the downsides of this system by dramatically revamping the rules every 5 or so years, which tends to shake up the hierarchy of performance as teams must find new technical solutions to achieve superlative performance. It was such a revamp that ended Mercedes' era of dominance in 2021, in fact. But sometimes these shakeups only perpetuate dominance, as wealthier teams are able to devote more of their budget to developing the new era of cars years in advance, whereas smaller teams must concentrate their spending on improving the car for the current season. So the solution to fixing F1's decline in the 2010s was never going to be to change what makes Formula One Formula One. But it's not like they had a whole lot of other good ideas either. For all that former CEO Bernie Ecclestone did for F1 over more than 50 years in the sport, after founding the Formula One Group in 1987 and captaining it as CEO for 30 years, there is one interview that's come to define F1's position in the 2010s. One critical miss that's come to encapsulate the dying days of his leadership of the sport. Speaking with the Campaign Asia Pacific magazine, Ecclestone articulated that he saw no value in reaching out to a younger generation of fans or building out the brand's social media presence. Why invest in pushing content over Facebook and Twitter, his logic went, when young people won't have the money required to interact with the sport's sponsors like Rolex or UBS? Sure, total viewership worldwide was plummeting year over year, but there was no point in trying to address that with viewers and fans with shallow pockets. So, a sport historically defined by a lack of parity, whose most interesting aspects were shrouded in esoteric design details, seemed destined to remain on the fringes. Then, in late 2016, the sport entered a quiet revolution as Liberty Media, well-versed in sports television and sports media generally, agreed to purchase the floundering Formula One Group for $4.4 billion. The vision was simple. Liberty Media had little intention of overhauling rules so core to the sport and so difficult to alter, but rather overhaul how the sport was consumed. As this pitch deck relayed, the opportunities were in promotion of F1 as a sport and brand, in digital distribution, and in more strategically developed events, essentially in widening the sport out from its narrow core audience. But at the simplest level, the problem standing in the way of growing the audience, as they saw it, was that the race at the front of the pack was not always very interesting. Therefore, the solution was also simple. make people care less about who was going to win the race. The transformation began at the Circuit of Catalunya in Barcelona, Spain, where preseason testing was taking place in late February 2017. First, a letter circulated to the teams stating that existing social media restrictions on filming and sharing photos and videos from the paddock were being lifted. Then, this post. A video tweeted out by Red Bull following the daily routine of its star driver Daniel Ricciardo, what he eats for breakfast and with whom, how he stretches and prepares for the testing, and him getting in the race car itself. A day later came another behind-the-scenes video, but this time from the Mercedes team, showing, through time lapses, how the team gets a car ready through the night for the eventual champion Lewis Hamilton the following day. With the restrictions lifted, it was a race between teams to start building out their own content. And notably, in both Red Bull and Mercedes' efforts, neither the car nor the testing was the focus. Rather, it was the people who drove them and built them that took center stage. Fans, it turned out, wanted to know more about who was under the helmet, and F1 obliged. Soon came this video on the Mercedes YouTube page, one of its earliest videos to break 1 million views, and while premised around doing what was never allowed before by touring the hospitality setup in Melbourne, the top comments have far less to say about the paddock and more on the character, charisma, and confidence of Lewis Hamilton. Viewers said they hadn't seen this side of him and now they wanted more. Similarly empowered, Daniel Ricciardo, Hamilton's rival on the racetrack, saw his profile begin to grow as the sport, his Red Bull team, and he himself pushed his brand and offered an entrance into the daily life of F1. From 2015 to 2017, the driver's Instagram profile took off, garnering hundreds of thousands of likes rather than the customary tens of thousands pulled in years prior. And while both drivers happened to be towards the front of the pack race in, race out, it wasn't only their success that garnered the increased attention. While Ricciardo's race results dipped from a high watermark in 2016 to losing a seat entirely in 2024, one can argue that he's never been as famous as he is now as an ever-available, equally fun-loving and emotionally open athlete that the most casual F1 fan recognizes and to an extent feels as though they understand. While that required only a simple change in policy, F1 quickly identified the opportunity of growing the off-track profiles of its drivers and started to play a more active role in it. This is a sampling of the official F1 Twitter page from January 19th, 2015. There are only 3 posts on that day, and all are using the app to push users to read old-school journalism content on F1's website. 2 years later, January 19th looked like this. More posts, 7 in total, a link to an article, some news reported right there on Twitter, a birthday wish to a driver, an old image, and a trend post. Now F1 wasn't just using Twitter to push to its website's content, it was using Twitter as a home for content itself. And most notably, not all the content was about on-track action. A lot was just about the drivers as people. By January 19th of 2025, this transformation was complete. Over 20 posts, all of it content for the fan to consume without leaving the app. A similar investment is visible with F1's YouTube page, as videos published in the year prior to this all-important interview outlining a bold new future for the sport number just over 250, while those posted after this video until the beginning of the 2018 season cleanly double that count, numbering in the low 500s. The effect of these shifts, F1 hoped, was that people would care more about, say, watching Daniel Ricciardo make his way from 10th to 8th place, and therefore be able to focus less on Hamilton maintaining a 10-second lead in first place. But that required them to get them to watch in the first place, and then keep them watching. If the sport was now to emphasize the driver as much as the car, and the characters as much as their positions across the field, it needed to match the social media push to get under the helmets. So, more cameras. Not just on the racecourse, but within the paddock as well. And more live microphones too. By 2018, the broadcast began to include the communications between drivers and their teams, and then communications between team principals and the FIA and the race directors. Now, what the viewer could not see in a standard race, the strategic communication, the high-stakes, high-stress decision-making, and the occasional argument over rules, they could experience through the audio. This, along with increased focus on investing more on-air time to the midfield rather than just the leaders, made a race more engaging for the less engineering-inclined viewer. Other moves made the races easier for casual viewers, from revamping the broadcast theme music for the US audience to adding an ever-present leaderboard so anyone flipping channels could understand the race's status immediately. These strategies seemingly worked. In 2018, for the first time in a decade, F1's unique viewership rose. And most promisingly, they made the biggest headway in the one market that's always been F1's white whale. The one viewer base that, up until that point, remained uncharmed by Formula One: America. So they doubled down on the strategy and turned the F1 grid into a format Americans were more used to: a reality TV show. It was called Drive to Survive. Debuting in 2018, this Netflix show gave audiences unprecedented levels of access into, particularly, the drama and personalities of the sport. Viewers were immediately captivated by Daniel Ricciardo and team principal Günther Steiner, and with an American audience that hit 1.2 million and a global audience that reached 7 million, almost a third of which were under 30, plenty were tuning into the series having never watched an actual race. F1 was going mainstream. The timing was impeccable, particularly for the US audience. F1's evolving digital strategy was already giving it momentum, but Drive to Survive launched just 1 year after F1 secured distribution rights in the States with ESPN. At the time, the sports network signed on for a steal, being granted the rights to air F1 races for free. By 2020, the company was paying a meager $5 million per year. But in the following 2 years, the US audience outright doubled, and so ESPN's license fee soon exploded too to upwards of $75 million annually. The Drive to Survive effect equaled big business for Formula One. Besides the licensing from ESPN, it increased viewers, followers, advertisers, and attendance. Now, the once Euro luxury car race that merely raised eyebrows in the States became one of the nation's most talked about events, with Formula One breaking records in Austin, Texas, by not only doubling its attendance from 263,000 in 2018 to 444,000 in 2022, but by becoming the most highly attended iteration of the race in its history, and one of the most attended Grand Prix in the sport's history outright. Liberty Media didn't stop there, however. They tripled down on America and expanded host cities to include two of the United States' most iconic and campy locations: Miami and Las Vegas. Here, money is flamboyant, and Formula One crowds flock to the oceanside, palm tree-lined avenues of the Florida coast starting in 2022. Demand was high, with 242,000 people attending over 3 days, more than 2.6 million tuning in on TV, and secondary market tickets reaching $32,000. And then, in 2023, the company added that casino-lit asphalt of the Nevada desert, and some 315,000 people attended over the weekend. With the race starting at 11 p.m. to satisfy European time zones and capitalize on the lights of Sin City, cars careened down the infamous Las Vegas Strip and through that infamous Vegas lot that F1 had purchased for $240 million, demonstrating the company's enduring commitment to the city and the sport. F1 was firmly in the American zeitgeist, and globally it had entirely reversed its path of decline. Although, for all that Drive to Survive and the early 2020s did for F1, with time, the sport eventually, once again, crashed head-on into its fatal flaw. After a thrilling championship battle fought down to the last lap of the last race of 2021, 2022 saw a return to boring, predictable dominance. Verstappen and Red Bull just couldn't stop winning. In fact, 2023 was, statistically, the most dominant season in F1 history, with Verstappen breaking records for wins, podiums, points, laps led, percentage of wins, consecutive victories, and more. It's therefore no surprise that viewership has essentially stagnated since 2022, and the new American races started to struggle to sell out. Now is the true test for F1. They're faced with a challenge of continuing to capture the attention of that fresh young audience gathered 5 years ago, even as the sport continues its historical trend of bouncing between thrilling battles and mundane processions. But what will undoubtedly endure is F1's impact on the world of sports marketing. Almost every professional sports league has since commissioned a streaming show attempting to replicate the recipe of Drive to Survive. Look at any TikTok or Instagram page for a team, and there's a good shot it features the kinds of parasocial, personality-first strategies pioneered by F1. It turns out, characters don't need to win to captivate an audience. What F1 recognized before most was that through making an audience care about the people underneath the helmet, audiences will tune in, even just to watch their favorite person lose. Speaking of streaming, the sponsor of this video is, perhaps unsurprisingly, a streaming site. I know you're probably sick of the pitch to join yet another streaming site, but regardless, I'm going to attempt to convince you that Nebula is more worth it than the others. It starts with the fact that it almost certainly would be the least expensive streaming site you subscribe to. Using our link, it's just $36 for a year, which works out to just $3 a month. Of course, that wouldn't make it a good deal unless you actually use the service, but the analytics show that the portion of subscribers who choose to stay subscribed is higher than almost every major streamer, even though, unlike the major streamers, Nebula sends you emails reminding you that your subscription is about to auto-renew. They're not trying to trap you in. Now, the reason people keep paying is the content. Nebula is filled with a hand-selected group of thoughtful, top-quality creators who all upload all their regular content there before YouTube with zero advertisements or sponsorships. But what really makes Nebula is the original content. There's all sorts of stuff, but I think a Wendover viewer would particularly enjoy Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore, where he breaks down influential conflicts in recent decades like the overthrow of Assad, the Irish Troubles, and the October 7th attacks in tremendous detail. This kind of show simply couldn't exist on YouTube due to its policies around war-related content. I think a Wendover viewer would also like the series by TLDR News, WTF USA, which covers American politics in real time from both a British and digital-first perspective. There's plenty more beyond that, and 2025 has the biggest schedule of original content to date. Nebula is creator-founded, creator-run, and creator-owned, so signing up is the best way to help support the independent creators you love. So if you want to both help support Wendover, get access to our videos ad and sponsorship free, and watch all of Nebula's originals, head over to nebula.tv/Wendover to get an annual subscription for 40% off and sign up today.